One of the things that you get to see from this side of the lectern that you don't get to see from your side is how beautiful all of you look, especially this front row with all the green. Thank you for being so in the spirit today. I appreciate my colleague Elizabeth Tarbach's words about the ocean and the way that we can feel ourselves present in the ocean. It has always been a source of solace for me, and I always wondered where that came from, because I grew up in much of my formative years, my early years, in the Midwest, inside, in places where there were no oceans. But what is interesting is that I began to think recently about how I was heard, and I picture in my mind one of my earliest memories, which is of a seascape, a beachscape, I would say, the way that I saw it, a beachscape of a big expanse of sand, except it wasn't sand. It was the sidewalk in front of our apartment in Columbus, Ohio. When I was a toddler and they would send me out, kind of hard to imagine now, to play by myself on the sidewalk in front of our house. And for me, it was this vast, sparkling landscape. It was really like a beach, except the sand was really, really hard. My friends and I would talk there for hours, and in the talking, the world around me came alive as I heard myself into truth with all my friends. They were called the kitties, and even though I would grow up really to be a dog person, they spoke in words instead of meows, and they lacked a certain corporeal robustness. In fact, they were my invisible friends. And before you get too judgmental, I'll just tell you that any number of people in the line after the first service told me about their invisible friends. So I am not alone in this. But it's interesting that by talking to them, even as a little 2-year-old, I made sense out of my world. I had to hear myself into truth through their ears, or whatever they had. In my high school years, I had a column in the school paper, and if this makes no sense to you, think of it like a blog, but on real paper. And then in my 20s, I was invited into my first pulpit. I entered into my 30th year through an 8-month conversation with a new friend whom I got to know through exchanging cassette tapes, which is something I really can't explain if you don't know what that is. Would anyone be willing to talk to someone after the service? Just raise your hand. Is it those people in the back, right? They can explain it, okay. But we had, this friend and I, this form of our own form of narrative therapy. We just kept talking to each other, and as we talked, we heard ourselves into truths about our own lives, and the shape of our life just took shape before us through those conversations, which were really just about speaking and then knowing that someone was going to listen to you. I watch it here all the time. The way that truth is found in our weekly Vesper service, our community circles, the grief group, our restorative practices, and even the check-ins at committee meetings, where we tell, maybe for just a minute or so, some truth from our own life. More than once, I have heard someone say, "Hey, I didn't realize this about my life until I just said that here." And it's true. These are all places where we tell our truths, and it's something we seem to need, whether we are an extrovert or an introvert, or like me, a little bit mix of both. Extroversion and introversion refer to what feeds you and how you gain energy in your life. So actually, though this is a little confusing, we can actually have introverted external processors who are probably just as confusing to themselves and everyone else around them as it sounds. Because they're people who get their energy from their inner life, but they only know they're getting it if they talk to someone else about it. And as many of them told me after the first service, they don't really want your opinion about it either. They just want to talk to you. So that is why the truths of our lives come into sharper focus when they're against the canvas of another life. And that's why friendships are so important, and community, because regardless, we need to be heard. Now, I want to stop right here and invite us all to take a breath. Because I know that for some of you here today, this is a hard topic, because you are feeling at some level deeply lonely. And I am actually not trying to be cute when I say that if you are feeling lonely this morning, you are not alone. because loneliness has become epidemic in our society. Survey after survey confirms that more than half of those polled in any context say that they feel persistently lonely in their lives. There is actually now an organization called the Campaign to End Loneliness, and it gives us some stark researched facts. Loneliness, living alone, and poor social connections are as bad for your health as smoking 15 cigarettes per day as far as life expectancies. Loneliness is worse for you as far as that than obesity. Lonely people are more likely to suffer from dementia, heart disease, and depression. Loneliness, in other words, increases your risk of illness and death. We live in a world in which writer Thomas Dunn says, loneliness has become a way of life. We are overworked, we are disconnected. There is this ceaseless amount of change where every time we look, something that we thought we could rely on has just been wiped out or is being challenged. There is this disconcerting, undulating economic order, which some people have said we should start to just call the economic disorder. And there's this national arena which really encourages us to retreat from the world, which not only cuts us off from the news of the world, but also from friends and news of friends. There is the ever-lurking, incomprehensible threat of climate change and a globe that has been shrunk by technology so that everybody, it seems, can see who has what and who does not. We are living longer lives. That doesn't necessarily always mean we are living longer lives with the people we love. And for many people, there is a period of life at the end where they are not with the people they expected to be with. There are losses compounded in a world by those who, as things change and change and change again, are left feeling bewildered, vulnerable, even shamed that they are now sort of out of the world as it is. We have, for those entering into our economy on the side of young adulthood, an economic vulnerability, which means multiple jobs often, multiple moves, that disrupts the patterns of friendships that we used to rely on, so that people are actually constantly changing locales, changing jobs, changing friendships. And we have a culture of overwork, which leaves little time for play, for rest, for friendship. Sometimes I talk to people who talk about how they had hoped in their elder years their grandchildren and great-grandchildren would be coming to visit them, but their grandchildren and great-grandchildren are all too busy to do so. There is a lack of that kind of intergenerational contact that people need so much, that Caitlin's beautiful call to worship spoke of. In our nation today, over 85% of those who are male identified and 66% of those who are female identified report working more than 40 hours a week, and statistics show that Americans work 137 more hours per year than Japanese workers, 260 more hours per year than British workers, and 499 more hours per year than people who live in France, so we all know where we want to go. But the point is that if we feel like we don't have time for friendship and connection, it's because we really might not have that time. Or the people that we want to have that time to connect with us might really not have that time. And all of this means that loneliness really can be a way of life. And this goes against our nature. Now, author and blogger, and that's like writing the column but not on paper, right? Okay, blogging, writes, "We crave to connect. We crave to be seen. We crave to comfort. It's a very useful kind of listening. It helps us create new nodes, get things done, coalesce our communities." She says that more and more her generation is looking at what it would be like to create a life that is based on connections more than possessions, on deep relationships rather than achievements which seem to be fleeting in all forms. She also says there's another kind of listening, a listening that we neglect at our own peril, that is not about getting us to some particular place, where we all agree, but simply about witnessing another human being in their journey. She writes, this kind of listening is long and open-ended, it's patient, it's curious, and it's not calculating. This kind of listening operates only on one level, the words coming out, the way they hit the ear, the shaping of the story, a sadness, a yearning, a wish. Thomas Dunn has written a book. The title is Loneliness as a Way of Life. And he says this: the inclination of modern life with its distractions and shallowness obscures the deeper fact of our separation from one another despite all these technologies that are supposed to connect us. And if you don't know about those, there's some people that can help you after the service. He says we need to establish a certain distance from our distractions in order to see just as clearly what it is we are seeking from one in each other: friendship, connection. Loneliness, he says, has actually become foundational in the world in which we live, in the sense that in the end, we are all to understanding ourselves as being alone in the world. The rise of modern loneliness, he says, coincides with the harmful experiment that we have, that we are increasingly disconnected from one another. And so the question, he says, is what are we to become as we live our lives? How are we to live with ourselves and each other? How are we to survive with loneliness as our way of life? Which brings us here to our religious community, because in fact, the word religion means to bind together. And that is at its very purpose, the purpose of our community here. The wish to be seen, to hear oneself into truth through communicating with another, is liberating when it happens, but when it does not, it is erasure. Ralph Ellison wrote the searing chronicle of African American life in the 60s in this nation called Invisible Man, and he wrote, "I am invisible, understand simply, because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you see sometimes in circus sideshows, it's as though I've been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings themselves, or figments of their imagination that cause them fear. Indeed, everything and anything except for me." Taken to such extremes, those who look and study such things know, isolation and loneliness can become very dangerous. Hannah Arendt is known for her work on looking at the causes of the Holocaust. And in the concluding pages of her work on the origins of totalitarianism, she says that totalitarianism is distinguished from other forms of tyranny in large part by the way it cultivates rule by terror, which is achieved mainly by isolating one another from one another, so that people are afraid to speak out, to speak together, and to connect. A universal loneliness among the citizens of a state, she says. So for us, again, as the people to bind together, our countercultural work is to bring us ourselves into relationship. We need especially to reach out to those who feel that the pace of change has made them irrelevant, like the song says, something put down, something which has become a cause of shame for them, and those who feel as if they are the targets of the hatred that is being generated by disconnection. In a recent conversation here with our Open Women's Group, which meets on the first Thursday of every month in the morning, they met last week, and I was privileged to be their guest. We were talking about change in the world, and one member said that, yes, it is true that in the 1950s the narrative was simpler. There were only a few major news sources and your local hometown paper, but a lot of that news came from the same sources. But she said, it was simpler if you fit into the narrative, but if you didn't fit into the narrative, it was a lot harder than today. Now we live in a world where we have so many, many, many narratives that it feels sometimes like if I tell my truth, I'm competing with your truth, and that we have to choose because we're trained to think that we're supposed to come to one conclusion. But folks, love is not a pizza, and community in its abundance does not require that kind of scarcity that we choose just one narrative among us. if we can consider and allow the vulnerability to think about how many truths there might be here among us, if we can allow ourselves to hear one another into truth and to remember that connection is at the heart of community. This kind of truth-telling is what we do in religious community. We hear one another, and especially in our tradition, we hear ourselves into truth in that way of walking with someone even when we don't really quite know what they are saying. Like when our partner, who is an external processor, just keeps talking and we know our job is really to listen, not to change it, not to influence it, not to advise, not even to adapt it. Truth comes before transformation, and we have to be able to tell our stories before we can make our communities places where we can hear where we're going together. I believe with all my heart that we can create here a place where we can hear one another into truth, despite differences, across experiences. And I believe we are called to do so evermore, because community is the antidote to our times and to that loneliness that people feel. We can be that community of abundance where we allow our truths to dance together. We can accompany one another if we are willing to take those brave risks of community. I have come to believe, especially in these last several months, when I have spent so much time listening to people across a wide range of truths, that holding one another's stories really ultimately boils down to being just a form of deep hospitality. We might not have the same words or the same perspectives, but people are asking across chasms of different experience to be heard, to be seen, to be noticed, to be witnessed. Courtney Martin says the new paradigm is about community first and foremost, and joy and meaning. It is, in short, she says, I've got your back, you've got mine. What I love about community is people will tell all kinds of truths, and recently a lot of people have felt a need to tell me that I look really tired. Thanks. I try really hard not to look really tired, but yes, I am really tired. And twice in the last 10 days, I've had the experience of finding myself speaking in front of a group and tearing up, which is actually not part of my normal oratorial tradition. So much so that in both cases, someone has rushed over to try to save me from myself. So fearful that I would make myself vulnerable in this way. I was actually okay with it. Because here's what I know. The first time was here at that meeting with our open women's group last week, our beloved elders. And the other time was 2 days ago, addressing predominantly younger group of religious professionals of color in our midst. Over the last 20 months, I have been the witness to a truth and reconciliation process within our faith, in which we've heard the stories of more than 125 people whose lives were damaged and sometimes utterly destroyed because people could not hear their truths or even stand to believe that they were true. And I have sat with so many here, beloved people, whom I dearly love after more than a decade of serving here, who are devastated by this world and everything that is happening, unable to reconcile what has happened within our nation, within the world they thought was one thing, that they helped create as one thing, and which seems to be another. We all have a need to be heard, and I believe we have the abundance of spirit to hear it. None of us are being asked to hold all of this, just willing to say our truths to one another and to hear the truths of others without vilifying or impugning anyone. I have lived and experienced it as surely as I did that conversation with my invisible friends, the kitties, on that beach that really wasn't a beach, where I lived when I was a toddler. I've experienced that we need to hear one another into truth. Disappointment, yes, as the hymn says, has pierced me through, and still, I kept on loving you, and you kept on loving me, And I'm reminded of the parallel with my being a toddler, because there is a freshness of spirit that I have seen that comes with these conversations when we put down the weapons of defensiveness and we put down our belief that one of our truths has to triumph and that we have to eradicate another person's truth. When we put that down, there is in fact exuberance, there is in fact joy. I have seen it done, I have seen it happen, and it is the closest thing to heaven on earth that I have experienced. It is my great wish that more and more of us can experience it in this community. I wish there was a roadmap or a recipe that we could put on a little card and give it to all of us and say, this is the next place we are going together. Believe me, if there was, I'd be up all night making copies for all of you. I'd put it on blogs, formats, any format you need. But there's not, folks. There's just us walking through this all together, listening to one another, trying to be a little less alone in our struggles. Just as long as we have breath, I believe that's what we must say yes to be that kind of sanctuary, to be that kind of place where we can say in the words of our anthem, "Thou art with me," meaning one another, that we are with one another, that we don't have to walk alone through the valley of the shadow. I believe that we can be the place where we live the vision that our transcendentalist ancestor Margaret Fuller had, one of the proto-feminists in our world, who died alone and rejected by her larger society when she said, "Two persons love in one another the future good which they aid one another to unfold." I believe we can be the place where we hear ourselves into truth and where we hear others into truth as well, where no one need be invisible because we hold many truths. I believe we can travel where we have not gone before because we have that kind of bravery, that kind of curiosity, that kind of courage among us. And it is my deep wish, my deep hope, and my fervent prayer that we will be the ones to make it so.